The golden rays of the late afternoon sun streamed gently through the blinds of room 308 at Memorial Grace Hospital, casting soft patterns on the pale walls. The room exuded a stark emptiness. Its only adornments were the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor and the faint hum of a distant floor polisher. Seated on the bed, Elliot Harper, 84, gazed absently out the window. His frail hands rested on the starched white sheet, their slight tremor betraying the years he had carried. The city skyline beyond the window seemed like a distant world, a world he once knew intimately but now only watched from afar. Elliot had lived a life that could fill countless pages. Decades spent building a small but beloved bookstore, tender years with his late wife, and moments of triumph raising 2 children. Yet now, his days stretched long and silent, punctuated only by the fleeting visits of hurried doctors and nurses. Their eyes were kind, but their presence felt impersonal, functional at best. It had been years since Elliot had seen his children. Though polite, they lived states away, tangled in the demands of their own lives, and their weekly calls felt increasingly obligatory. Loneliness hung in the air like a heavy fog, wrapping around him with every passing moment. As tevening shadows began to deepen, Elliot's gaze fell back to the worn book resting on the bedside table, a gift from his late wife, Clara. Its pages, yellowed with age, offered the comfort of familiarity, but tonight, even those words felt distant. The world seemed to be moving on without him, leaving Elliot adrift in a sea of memories. The hum of life beyond his door, the bustling footsteps of nurses, the faint laughter of visiting families, felt like a cruel reminder of all he had lost. Yet, within the stillness, a quiet ache for connection remained, as persistent as the steady beat of the monitor beside him. He could not escape this loneliness, but perhaps, he thought, there was still room for one more chapter in his story. He just didn't know it yet. In the dimly lit hallway just outside room 308, Grace Delgado, a seasoned nurse in her late 40s, glanced at Elliot's chart. Her tired eyes skimmed the details: heart condition, history of hypertension, mobility challenges. But what stood out most was the note scrawled in the corner: no visitors. Grace had worked at Memorial Grace Hospital for nearly 2 decades. She had seen her fair share of patients, angry, scared, and resigned. But something about Elliot Harper struck a chord deep within her. Perhaps it was the weary yet dignified way he carried himself, or the lonely silence seemed to follow him like a shadow. Either way, Grace felt compelled to pause, even though her shift was nearly over, and her feet ached from endless hours on the move. The hospital buzzed with its usual end-of-day chaos. Nurses exchanged hurried instructions, janitors began their evening rounds, and visitors said quick goodbyes before the lights dimmed for the night. Amid the clamor, Grace leaned against the wall, staring at Elliot's door. Her mind wandered to her father, who had passed away years ago in a similar sterile room. She had been too busy to visit him often. A regret still gnawed at her when she least expected it. Her stomach growled, a sharp reminder of the sandwich waiting in her bag. She could go home, forget the pull toward room 308, and resume her routine. But something in her heart urged her otherwise. Taking a deep breath, Grace straightened her shoulders, smoothed her scrubs, and pushed open the door. "Good evening, Mr. Harper," Grace said softly as she entered the room. Elliot turned his head slowly, his tired eyes meeting hers. "Evening," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. His words carried a hint of surprise, as though he hadn't expected anyone to speak to him beyond the routine check of his vitals. Grace pulled a chair close to his bedside and sat down, offering him a warm smile. "I thought I'd stop by before heading home. Do you mind if I sit with you for a bit?" Elliot raised a thin, trembling hand in a half-hearted gesture. "I don't have much to offer regarding company," he murmured. Grace chuckled softly. "That's all right. I'm here for the tea and riveting conversation," she said, her tone light but kind. A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of Elliot's lips. It was the first time he had felt a flicker of warmth from another person in weeks. "Well, I'm afraid the tea selection here is dreadful," he said, his voice carrying the faintest trace of humor. "Noted," Grace replied with a grin. "We'll work on that." For the next hour, They talked. Grace asked about Elliot's life, and at first, his answers were curt, as though he wasn't sure anyone truly wanted to hear his story. But her gentle persistence broke through his hesitance. Slowly, he began to share fragments of his life. How he had built his bookstore from nothing, the joy he had found in recommending novels to eager young readers, and the quiet grief that had settled in after his wife, Clara, passed away. "I suppose the world moved on," Elliot said after a long pause, his gaze fixed on the window. "And I stayed behind." Grace leaned forward, resting her elbows on the edge of the bed. "Or maybe the world just hasn't caught up to you yet," she said softly. Elliot blinked, startled by her response, and the inn gave a slight, thoughtful nod. "You're kinder than most, you know," he said. "It doesn't take much to be kind," Grace replied. "But it does take a little time." When Elliot's voice grew tired, Grace noticed a book on the bedside table. Its worn cover and dog-eared pages spoke of years of use. "Would you like me to read to you?" she asked, picking it up. Elliot hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "That would be nice," he said. As Grace read, her voice warm and melodic, the room seemed to fill with a quiet peace. Elliot closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to savor the comfort of having someone near. The sterile hospital room felt a little less cold for the first time in weeks. Neither of them realized that this simple act of kindness was already beginning to ripple outward. A wealthy businessman, Jonathan Bennett, sat by his mother's bedside in the room next door. Hearing Grace's voice through the thin walls, he paused, his usual detachment momentarily replaced by curiosity. Something about the kindness in her tone tugged at him, though he couldn't quite understand why. All he knew was that it stirred something dormant in his heart, a feeling he hadn't let himself feel in years. Grace returned to room 308 the following evening, though it was her day off. She had spent the day running errands, stretching her modest paycheck to cover groceries and bills, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Elliot. The image of him sitting alone in that stark room weighed heavily on her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her presence had brought him some comfort. Carrying a small paper bag, Grace entered the hospital with a shy wave to the receptionist. "I'm here to visit Mr. Harper," she said. When she reached his room, she knocked lightly before pushing the door open. Elliot's face lit up with genuine surprise as she stepped inside. "Back again, Nurse Grace?" he asked, a trace of humor in his tone. "Just Grace today," she replied, pulling a thermos and a small container from the back. "And I thought you might appreciate some tea." "The hospital's version isn't exactly 5-star. Elliot chuckled, the sound faint but heartfelt. "Well, aren't I spoiled? What kind of tea is it?" "Chamomile," Grace said, pouring the steaming liquid into a cup. "My mom used to make it for me when I wasn't feeling well. Always seemed to do the trick." Elliot cupped the warm mug as though it were a treasure. His eyes softened as he took a sip, and a small smile spread across his face. "Perfect," he murmured. Grace opened the container, revealing a slice of banana bread. "I made this last night. I'm no master baker, but I think it turned out okay," she said, cutting it into smaller pieces. Elliot took a bite and closed his eyes, savoring the flavor. "This is wonderful," he said. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "It's no trouble," Grace replied with a smile. "Sometimes, the little things make a big difference." As they talked, the conversation flowed effortlessly. Grace learned more about Elliot's life, his favorite authors, the joys and challenges of running a bookstore, and the quiet moments he cherished with Clara. In turn, she shared stories of her bustling childhood neighborhood, the struggles of nursing school, and the little joys she found in her work. Elliot's face seemed lighter, the lines of worry and sorrow softening as they spoke. Laughter bubbled up between them, small but genuine, and the weight of loneliness lifted. For a brief moment. Meanwhile, Jonathan Bennett sat by his mother's bedside in the adjacent rooms, crawling absently on his phone. He had visited her out of obligation rather than affection, his thoughts consumed by the demands of his thriving business empire. But as he mindlessly refreshed his emails, Grace's voice drifted through the thin walls. It was the same voice he had heard the night before, reading to the older man in the next room. Something about it felt different, genuine, soothing. It wasn't the clinical tone of a nurse going through the motions, nor the detached professionalism he often encountered. This was kindness, pure and unfiltered. Curiosity piqued. Jonathan set his phone aside and stepped into the hallway. Following the sound, he stopped outside Elliot's partially open door. Peering inside, he saw Grace seated by the older man's bedside, her posture relaxed and expression warm. She wasn't just present but engaged, listening intently to Elliot's every word as though nothing else mattered. Jonathan lingered there, unnoticed, his mind racing. He had spent years building his empire, accumulating wealth and power, but watching this simple interaction stirred something unfamiliar within him, a quiet yearning he couldn't quite place. That night, Grace carried a sense of quiet satisfaction as she walked home under the fading light. She had made Elliot's evening brighter, perhaps in a way he desperately needed, but she couldn't have known that her simple act of compassion had reached far beyond room 308. Jonathan Bennett sat in his immaculate penthouse in his world of tailored suits and corporate boardrooms, staring out at the city lights. His thoughts kept returning to the scene he had witnessed, to the nurse whose kindness had managed to pierce the armor of his carefully constructed life. For reasons he couldn't yet explain, he felt compelled to act. But how? And why? Unbeknownst to Grace, her small gestures had set something in motion. Something that would soon change not only Elliot's life but her own in ways she could never have imagined. The following day, Grace was at the hospital again, earlier than her usual shift. She wasn't scheduled to work, but her thoughts were preoccupied with Elliot Harper. The memory of his soft laughter and the glimmer of hope in his eyes lingered with her, tugging at her heart. She carried a small bouquet of daisies she had picked up at a nearby flower stall and approached room 308 with a gentle knock. Elliot turned his head toward the door, his face lighting up with recognition. "Back again, Grace?" he asked, his tone warmer than the day before. "Good morning, Mr. Harper," she replied, smiling, stepping inside, and placing in an empty water pitcher by his bedside. "I figured your room could use a little color." Elliot chuckled softly, his frail fingers brushing the edge of the blanket. "You're determined to spoil me, aren't you?" Grace took a seat beside him, her smile widening. "Well, someone has to. How are you feeling today?" Elliot hesitated for a moment as though weighing his words. "Better, I think," he said finally. "Not just physically. It's been a long time since anyone sat and listened. You've given this old man something to look forward to." Her heart softened at his words. "You deserve it," she said. "Everyone does." Their conversation flowed easily again, moving from light-hearted topics to personal reflections. Elliot spoke more openly now, sharing memories of his wife Clara and the life they had built together. Grace, in turn, told him about her passion for nursing and the struggles she faced trying to balance her work with her modest life outside the hospital. "I suppose we both know a little something about giving to others," Elliot said after a pause. "It's a noble thing, but not always easy." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "No, it's not. But sometimes, it feels like the only thing that makes sense." The sincerity in her voice struck Elliot, and for a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the daisies on the bedside table catching the soft morning light. As Grace continued her visits to Elliot, Jonathan Bennett returned to the hospital more often than usual. His mother's condition had stabilized, and there was little need for his frequent presence. Yet, he couldn't stay away. Something about Grace's interactions with Elliot intrigued him, a raw, unpretentious humanity he hadn't encountered in years. One afternoon, as Grace left Elliot's room, Jonathan lingered in the hallway, pretending to review emails on his phone. When she walked past him, he stepped forward. "Grace, right?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of curiosity. She paused, slightly startled, before recognizing him. "Mr. Bennett," she replied politely, her brow furrowing slightly. "Yes, I'm Grace. Is there something I can help you with?" He hesitated, uncharacteristically unsure of himself. "I noticed how much time you've been spending with Mr. Harper," he said. "You seem to care a great deal about your patients." Grace's cheeks flushed slightly, and she shrugged. "I just do what I can. No one should feel forgotten, especially when sick or alone." Jonathan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Not everyone sees it that way. What you're doing, it's rare." She tilted her head, studying him. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett, but I'm just a nurse. It's part of the job." Jonathan's lips quirked into a faint smile. "You're underselling yourself. Most people wouldn't go above and beyond like you do." Grace wasn't sure how to respond. She shifted her weight slightly, her fingers brushing against the hem of her scrub top. "I appreciate the kind words, but I should get back to work." Before she could step away, Jonathan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek business card. "If you ever need anything at all, call me," he said, handing it to her. Grace stared at the card momentarily before taking it, her fingers brushing his. "I'm not sure what I could ask for," she said honestly. "But thank you." Jonathan's gaze lingered on her, his usual businesslike demeanor replaced with something softer, more genuine. "Sometimes the smallest things make the biggest difference," he said quietly. As Grace returned to her rounds, she couldn't shake the brief encounter from her mind. The card remained tucked in her pocket, a small but persistent reminder of a possibility she couldn't yet define. Meanwhile, Jonathan stood in the hallway, staring after her, a faint sense of clarity beginning to shape his mind. Back in her apartment that evening, Grace sat on her worn-out sofa, the business card in her hand. She turned it over repeatedly, contemplating what, if anything, it meant. She wasn't used to being noticed, let alone by someone like Jonathan Bennett. Yet, something about the way he had spoken to her felt different, genuine. Little did she know, their brief exchange was the first step in a journey that would intertwine their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. The days passed, and Grace continued her quiet routine at the hospital, always visiting Elliot Harper, even if only for a few minutes during her shift. Their bond grew stronger with each conversation and the small rituals they shared. Her bringing tea, reading to him, or simply sitting in companionable silence became the highlights of his days. But as Elliot's health stabilized, an inevitable question loomed. What would happen when he was discharged? Grace knew the hospital couldn't keep him indefinitely, and the thought of Elliot returning to an empty home with no one to care for him filled her with dread. She needed to do something, but didn't know where to start. One afternoon, as she adjusted Elliot's pillows and scanned his vitals, Grace decided to broach the subject. "Mr. Harper, have you thought about what happens when you leave here?" she asked gently. Elliot sighed, his frail fingers tracing the edge of his blanket. "There's not much to think about," he replied. "I'll go home. I'll manage. I always have." Grace frowned, her heart heavy with worry. "Do you have anyone who can help? Family? Friends?" He shook his head, his expression tinged with sadness. "My children have their own lives. They call now and then, but it's not the same. And Clara, she was my anchor. Without her, the house just feels hollow." The weight of his loneliness pressed down on Grace. She squeezed his hand gently. "You shouldn't have to go through this alone," she said softly. Elliot gave her a small, bittersweet smile. "I've had a good life, Grace. Better than most. I'm grateful for that. But this part, it's something I'll have to face on my own." As Grace sat in the hospital break room sipping lukewarm coffee that evening, her mind raced. She couldn't bear the thought of Elliot slipping through the cracks, forgotten by a world too busy to care. She reached into her pocket and pulled out Jonathan Bennett's business card. Her fingers hovered over her phone for several moments before she took a deep breath and dialed the number. "Jonathan Bennett speaking," came his crisp, professional voice. "Mr. Bennett, it's Grace Delgado," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "The nurse you spoke to last week." "Grace," Jonathan replied, his tone instantly warming. "I've been hoping to hear from you. What's on your mind?" She hesitated, then launched into an explanation about Elliot, his resilience, his loneliness, and her fear that he might be left to fend for himself after discharge. "I don't know if there's anything you can do," she concluded, "but I thought it was worth asking." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Jonathan spoke again, his voice resolute. "Leave it to me." Jonathan arrived at the hospital the next day, his usual sharp suit and confident stride softened by a newfound sense of purpose. He asked to meet with Elliot, and Grace introduced them, her heart fluttering with hope and apprehension. Jonathan pulled up a chair beside Elliot's bed, his demeanor unusually personal. "Mr. Harper," he began, his tone warm and sincere. Grace told me a bit about your situation, and I'd like to help. Elliot blinked, clearly surprised. Help? I don't understand. Jonathan leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees. I run a foundation that provides housing and care for seniors who need it. It's well-staffed, comfortable, and not far from here. If you're open to it, I'd like to offer you a place. Elliot's eyes widened, his voice trembling. That sounds too good to be true. It's true, Jonathan assured him. Consider it a small gesture of gratitude for everything you've given as a teacher. People like you shaped my generation. It's the least I can do. Tears welled in Elliot's eyes, and he looked toward Grace, who stood by the door, her eyes glistening with emotion. She had never witnessed such an unprompted act of generosity, and it left her momentarily speechless. Over the next week, arrangements were made for Elliot's transition to the Foundation's residence. Grace helped him pack his few belongings, ensuring he had everything. On the day of his discharge, she accompanied him to his new home, a cheerful facility with a garden, a cozy library, and a staff that greeted him with warmth and care. As they said their goodbyes, Elliot gripped Grace's hand tightly. "You've been my angel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," Grace replied, tears streaming down her face. "Just promise me you'll enjoy this next chapter." Later that evening, as Grace left the hospital, she found Jonathan waiting for her in the parking lot. His expression was uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "Thank me?" Grace asked, bewildered. "You're the one who helped Elliot." Jonathan smiled faintly. "But you're the one who cared enough to ask. Most people wouldn't have." He reached into his jacket pocket and handed her an envelope. "This is for you," he said simply. Grace hesitated. "What is it?" "Call it a token of appreciation," Jonathan replied. "You reminded me what it means to connect with people truly. I'd lost sight of it, and for that, I owe you more than I can say." When Grace opened the envelope later that night, she found a check for $5,000 inside. Her heart raced, and her eyes filled with tears. For someone living paycheck to paycheck, it felt like a fortune. But beyond the money, the recognition of her compassion and humanity moved her the most. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the check, Grace couldn't help but wonder what this unexpected connection with Jonathan Bennett might lead to next. The following day, Grace returned to her routine at the hospital, the envelope from Jonathan still weighing heavily on her mind. She hadn't decided what to do with the money, but she knew one thing for sure: had given her a renewed sense of purpose. She approached her duties with a quiet determination, but the thought of Jonathan's offer lingered, like the beginning of a story she hadn't yet written. Elliot's absence left a noticeable void in her day. She missed the sound of his soft laughter and the thoughtful way he shared his memories. However, her worry for him was eased by the knowledge that he was settling into his new home, surrounded by comfort and care. That evening, as Grace folded laundry in her modest apartment, her phone buzzed. It was Jonathan. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Grace," Jonathan said, his voice calm but purposeful. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, about what you said, and what you've done for Elliot." Grace felt her cheeks flush, unsure how to respond. "I was just doing my job," she replied softly. "It's more than that," Jonathan insisted. "I see the way you connect with people and make them feel seen. It's rare. And it's made me realize that I've been too focused on building wealth and not enough on building something meaningful." Grace frowned slightly, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "I want to create something bigger," he said. "A community program, a foundation, maybe. A place where people like Elliot can find companionship and care. And where people like you, who give so much of themselves, can have the support and resources they need." Grace blinked, stunned by the scope of his words. "That's a wonderful idea," she said slowly, "but I'm not sure how I fit into it." Jonathan chuckled softly. "You're the heart of it, Grace. You already know what people need. You've lived it. I'd fund it, but I want you to help lead it, to shape it into something that makes a real difference." The weight of his words settled over her, equal parts exhilarating and terrifying. "That's a lot to think about," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I'm not asking you to decide now, Jonathan said gently. Take your time. But just know, I believe in you. Over the next few weeks, Grace could not shake the idea. Every time she walked the hospital's hallways or sat with a patient, she thought about the foundation Jonathan had described. The possibilities were endless. A space where seniors could find companionship, caregivers could feel supported, and small acts of kindness could ripple outward into something transformative. One evening, as she sat in her apartment, staring at the check Jonathan had given her, she made a decision. Picking up her phone, she dialed his number. "Jonathan," she said when he answered, "I've been thinking about your offer, and I want to try." The relief in his voice was palpable. "I knew you would," he said warmly. "Let's meet tomorrow to discuss the next steps." The following day, they sat in a small cafe, sketching ideas on napkins and notebook pages. Jonathan listened intently as Grace described her vision, a community hub providing practical support and emotional connection. She spoke of workshops for caregivers, social events for seniors, and resources for those facing isolation. Jonathan nodded, his enthusiasm growing with every word. "We'll start small," he said, "but with your heart and my resources, I know we can make this work." Within weeks, they rented a modest office space and began building connections with local hospitals, senior care facilities, and community organizations. Grace used part of the check to fund small, meaningful gestures, care packages for seniors, free workshops for nurses, and weekly gatherings where patients could connect over tea and conversation. The program, which they named the Heartlight Foundation, quickly gained momentum. Grace's genuine care and insight drew volunteers from all walks of life, and Jonathan's financial backing ensured they had the resources to make a lasting impact. One afternoon, Elliot visited the foundation's office, walking with the help of a cane but radiating vitality. He sat with Grace and Jonathan, marveling at their progress. "You two are a force to be reckoned with," Elliot said, his voice filled with pride. "If this is what kindness can do, the world could use much more of it." Grace smiled, glancing at Jonathan, who nodded in agreement. "It all started with you, Elliot," she said softly. "Your story reminded me why I became a nurse. And it reminded Jonathan what it means to give truly." Elliot's eyes glistened with emotion. "Then I'd say we've all found our purpose," he said. As the weeks turned into months, the Heartlight Foundation transformed the lives of those it served and those who made it possible. Grace, who had once doubted her ability to make a difference, found herself at the center of something extraordinary. And Jonathan, who had spent so many years chasing success, discovered a more profound sense of fulfillment through their shared mission. Together, they proved that even the most minor acts of kindness could spark something far more significant, a legacy of compassion that would endure for generations. As the Heartlight Foundation gained traction, its impact extended beyond what Grace or Jonathan could have imagined. The weekly gatherings became a haven for seniors like Elliot, who found solace in the companionship of others. Caregivers attended workshops that rejuvenated their spirits, equipping them with skills and emotional support to continue their essential work. The foundation began to draw attention from local media, and soon, more donors and volunteers offered their time and resources. Grace's life transformed alongside the foundation's growth. She moved into a slightly larger apartment closer to work, her financial burden eased by her new role. Though her days were packed with meetings and community outreach, she still carved out time for her patients at the hospital. She didn't want to lose touch with what had inspired her in the first place. Elliot became a regular presence at the foundation, often leading book discussions or sitting in the garden with others who needed a listening ear. His health improved, and with each passing day, he seemed more vibrant, a living testament to the foundation's mission. Jonathan, too, experienced profound changes. He shifted his focus from his corporate empire to philanthropy, using his influence to champion the foundation's initiatives. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely connected to the world around him, his heart softened by the kindness and resilience he witnessed daily. One evening, Grace and Jonathan sat in the foundation's office, reviewing plans for an upcoming fundraising event. The space was quiet, the hum of the city outside barely audible. Grace leaned back in her chair, a tired but contented smile on her face. "Do you ever think about how this all started?" Jonathan asked, his tone reflective. Grace nodded, her smile widening. "It started with Elliot," she said softly. "And a cup of tea." Jonathan chuckled, shaking his head. "And you? It started because you cared enough to stay." Their eyes met, and momentarily, the weight of everything they had built hung between them. A shared accomplishment rooted in compassion and the belief that even small actions could spark extraordinary change. Months later, the Heartlight Foundation was thriving. Its impact reached seniors, caregivers, and the broader community, inspiring other organizations to adopt similar models. Grace had become a respected leader, and her humility and dedication earned admiration from everyone she worked with. As Grace prepared for a busy day one morning, her phone buzzed with an unexpected call. It was Elliot. "Grace," he said, his voice warm and steady. "I wanted to let you know. I've decided to write a book." "A book?" she replied, surprised but delighted. "What about?" "About all of this," Elliot said. "My life, the foundation, the kindness I've been shown. I want people to understand that it's never too late to find purpose, to matter." Grace felt a lump rise in her throat. "That's a wonderful idea, Elliot. I'll be your first reader." Over the following weeks, Elliot worked tirelessly on his manuscript, drawing from his years of experience and the new hope he had found. Grace and Jonathan supported him every step of the way, offering encouragement and helping him navigate the publishing process. The Heart of Light became a local sensation when the book The Heart of Light was released. Elliot's heartfelt words resonated with readers, reminding them of the power of kindness and the profound impact of human connection. The proceeds from the book were donated to the foundation, ensuring its mission would continue to grow. At the book's launch event in the foundation's bustling community center, Elliot stood at the podium, his cane steady in one hand and a copy of his book in the other. He looked out at the crowd, volunteers, caregivers, seniors, and supporters, all brought together by a single act of compassion. "I used to think my story was over," Elliot said, his voice strong and clear. "But Grace showed me that there's always room for another chapter. And now, thanks to all of you, my story is part of something much bigger." The room erupted in applause, and Grace felt a tear slip down her cheek. She glanced at Jonathan, who nodded, his own eyes glistening. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and the city skyline shimmered in the distance, Grace and Jonathan sat on a bench in the garden. The air was cool, the scent of blooming flowers lingering around them. "You've built something incredible," Jonathan said, his voice low but enthusiastic. "We've built something incredible," Grace corrected, her gaze steady. "And it all started with Elliot." Jonathan smiled, leaning back to look at the stars. "Do you ever wonder what's next?" Grace considered his question, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Whatever it is," she said, "I think we'll face it together." As the garden lights cast a warm glow around them, Grace realized that the foundation wasn't just a project or a job, but a reflection of everything she believed in. And though the journey had started with a simple cup of tea, it had blossomed into a legacy of compassion, proving that even the most minor acts of kindness could illuminate the world's darkest corners.